Welcome everyone to Epoch Philosophy, just in podcast form. Thanks to everyone who supports this podcast and our YouTube channel on Patreon in the YouTube member section. Couldn't do any of this without you. If you want to ensure that our YouTube channel and podcast survives, consider pledging just a couple dollars a month. It's the only thing that ensures that we survive and can keep making content. Some clarification before the podcast. This has been recorded in the past via a live stream I had on YouTube, and I figured I would upload these as to breathe new life to them and introduce them into more audiences. So if my audio sounds a little bit different than normal, this is why this has been recorded in the past. So without further ado, thank you guys for being here and enjoy the podcast. All right, yo, what's going on, guys? We got Matt McManus here today. We will see. Let's see if I can get the audio right on here. Typically, Matt, I just upgraded to a new microphone, and it has been a pain in the fucking ass to dial this thing down. So, chat, everything sound good? Everything sound okay? Matt, does everything sound good on your end anyways, as well?
It sounds good to me, man.
Hell yes. Okay. All right. So what's going on, man? What have you been up to? We were talking a little bit earlier before stream started, but yeah, how's life?
I'm pretty fucking bored. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, when this whole thing began about a year ago, I figured, wow, it'll be like 5-6 months or something like that. And the other day, I was watching a movie with my wife, and it was fucking mind-boggling because I was just watching and being like, what are these people doing outside, and why are they like hugging and all that stuff? And I realized that I've started to internalize this lifestyle,
Yeah.
Where the idea of physical contact with another human being seems a little weird.
Yeah, man.
Like this just gotta end.
Yeah, like you'll watch movies and shit with people are not wearing masks and stuff like that. You're like, holy fuck, dude.
Right?
They're like in groups of in crowds of people, and they're just like they're going along like everything's normal. No, I feel that completely. It's really weird. It's really weird times. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Fucking, what was I watching? Watch this movie with Russell Brand and Jonah Hill. It was on Netflix called Get Them to the Greek. Basically, it's like a fucking drinking comedy road trip film. It's pretty funny, but long story short, like they were at a bar and they were all partying, and I was just like, man, I remember when we used to do things like that. We'd go to bars, we'd meet friends. One day.
Yeah. So, all right. So I actually have, I'm plugging your book right here, guys. I'm pretty sure all of you guys in chat know who Matt McManus is, but author of What is Postmodern Conservatism? Essays on Our Hugely Tremendous Times. I actually got it right here, Matt. I have not read it. I have not read it yet, so forgive me on that end, but I have.
Shame on you.
Yeah, I know, my fault. But no, for real, since I started this YouTube channel, dude, holy fuck, the immense amount of just stacks of books that I like, because that's kind of like my thing. Like I try to translate philosophical text, books of theory into video form. And I'm so sorry, man. I haven't even fucking reached like 1/3 of like prior historical like theorists and shit like that.
Oh, don't worry about it at all. Honestly, I get a lot of people who send me shit to read at this point, and I feel bad because I can't look at like a fucking half of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm usually just like, oh, it looks good. Fair enough. If there was enough time for us to read everything that's worth reading, then we'd all wind up being 600, right?
150%, dude. So it was interesting. So like I think a lot of my chat is pretty well acquainted with postmodern conservatism as a whole. What do you have you so something that I've noticed, like I think the idea of pinning down theoretically something like postmodern conservatism is kind of like, honestly, dude, like bravo, it's kind of genius, because I think that's the one thing a lot of people have noticed is that, like, Jesus fucking Christ, like it is the quote unquote conservatives that are this new postmodern entity in today's world. And I was wondering where you sort of like kind of really concretely pin that down, because I know you did some writing about Jordan Peterson, and I find Jordan Peterson to be ironically like pretty kind of postmodern in some ways, right? So
in some ways, we can definitely talk about that if you want. But I was just going to say, one of the most fucking amazing things about this book was people liked it and all that kind of stuff. But after the Capitol Hill riots, where the QAnon shaman just fucking bailed into the Senate wearing that big buffalo outfit, right? I just got barrages of emails and people tweeting at me being like, we guess you're right.
Yeah.
You know, if anything, a lot of these far right douchebags prove my point better than I ever could. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, was there a lot of like pushback on the idea of something like postmodern conservatism? Because it makes perfect fucking sense to me.
Yeah, initially, right? And to your question more seriously, right? Kind of roots of the whole project go back to, I guess, around late 2015, 2016. So I was finishing my PhD, and I was also working as a door-to-door salesman to make ends meet, as one does in grad school now. And I was following the election, the U.S. election, pretty closely with me and my buddies, because Canada, U.S., American politics is basically a spectator sport.
100%.
And we all got a little bit concerned when it looked like Donald Trump was actually going to clinch the Republican nomination. But full disclosure, none of us actually expected him to win. And I'm never going to forget this evening in 2016, where myself and my buddies were all hanging around at my apartment, which includes all the people from the Pill Pod, by the way, those of you who listen to us. Victor and Pills and Eric.
I think Victor told me the story.
Yeah, exactly. And so we were watching the election, and all of us were like, I wonder how much she's going to win by. And we were doing the typical leftist, like, well, the minute she's in office, we're going to have to start putting pressure on the Dems. Not that they're going to listen, neoliberal this and neoliberal that. And then just by the end of the night, everybody was fucking in tears, right? Just like, oh my God, what the hell is happening? I've opened a bottle of whiskey that I was saving for a special occasion because I was like, it's just needed now. We need some kind of anesthetic.
Right. I don't think I remember so clearly, and I'm sure people in chat and all over that are listening, but like, do you remember the day after the US election? Like, I remember it clear as day, the way that I felt. Like, it was terrible. Like, it was just, it was, I've never felt that way in my entire life, ever. That was the only day I have felt. It was this really weird sort of like confused anxiety. It wasn't like total anxiety because nothing was immediately threatening you, right? But it was like this weird, like, I've never felt that way ever since that day after Donald Trump won. And I know some like, the Twitter shit, like, oh, we got Trump deranged syndrome or some shit. But no, for real, like, it was the weirdest thing because there were so many question marks and so many unknowns that, it was terrible.
Oh, it was bizarre. And I even know some conservatives who later came to support Trump who actually described it as surreal, right? Because you kind of sit there and you think, oh, there's this reality TV president who's had several wives and who's probably slept around with all kinds of sleazy people. And now he's president of the United States and he's going to have the nuclear codes. Well, how about that? And beyond all the kind of odd, funny elements of this, there was something that was deeply disturbing about it. Right. Now, I know that there are a lot of people who are prone to calling Trump a fascist, and I can certainly understand the temptation to do so. I push back on that thesis a little bit, and we can talk about that if you want to know why.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I kind of got the sense that at the time, it wasn't really sensible to apply a concept or a political terminology that was really situated in early 20th century European context, and apply it kind of ad hoc to what was going on now. So what I did after 2016 was decide that I really need to start taking the political right more seriously and delve more deeply into its history. So one of the things that I did was basically start by going back to the beginning. I cracked open my old copy of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, went through some of his stuff on the Sublime and the Beautiful. And what I noticed about the problems with Enlightenment, like reason, how it is that essentially elitist Western philosophers thought that they knew everything and felt they should run the world as a consequence of that. Why it is that we need to understand truth and truth claims, especially moral truth claims, in local and historical context. It echoed a lot of stuff some of the POMO theorists that I had read back in the day were saying, albeit with a very kind of different political implication, right? So that's around the time where I got the genesis of the idea. And the first way that I kind of cashed this out was in a paper that was published for the International Journal of Zizek Studies. I'm a fan, and I kind of gave it a bit of a Zizek ideology studies type take. But then I published a series of magazine articles on postmodern conservatism, each one kind of building the argument a little bit further. And the reception was pretty invested, right? People seemed to like it or be interested in the idea. So that's when I decided to release my 2 books on the subject. One is the more academic monograph, The Rise of Postmodern Conservatism for Palgrave Macmillan. Then there's the collection of essays you mentioned for 0 books.
Yeah, gotcha. So, you said that you don't think Trump is a fascist, and you think it's a mistake to label him as that. It's actually kind of funny. Maybe this is lazy language on my part. I actually kind of think Donald Trump fits. I absolutely see the massive differences in actual traditional theoretical, like the more academic end of fascism, which a lot of people today don't even realize existed. Like fascism was a super intellectual thing in the early 20th century. But I have considered Trump like a fascist, but mainly like a newborn sort of neo-fascist. So would you consider Trump like anywhere near like the fascist like realm of things, or do you think neo-fascist is probably more appropriate, or what are the very things about Trump that you think are very distinctly like, yeah, we can't call this guy a fascist at all?
Oh, I think there are a huge number of elective affinities between Trumpism and fascism, right? Not least of which is the transformation of politics into a kind of hyper-real spectacle, right? A lot of people mistakenly associate fascism with a purely nostalgic return to older ways of doing things. And you can think about, the Nazis' appeals to things like the Second and the First Reich, or Mussolini's appeals to creating a new Roman Empire, right? But as Walter Benjamin and other critical theorists will point out, there was a very modern edge to fascism as well, right? Particularly the kind of eroticization or fetishization of military technology and the associated sense of strength that came with that, but also in their turn to the most modern and technically advanced kinds of entertainment that were available at the time, right? The Nazis were hugely invested, for instance, in producing German cinema and poured unbelievable amounts of money into it, along with radio. The same was true of Mussolini. And Walter Benjamin analyzes this and says, look, one of the reasons they're doing this is fascism is primarily an affective way of looking at the world, right? It breaks very stridently from the contours of Western rationalism. And the kind of politics that you see associated with that are consequently affective. But they're also about entertainment, right? Fascism is a society that turns itself into a kind of very dark entertainment, since, of course, nothing is more sublime in a certain sense than war, right? Nothing fills your attention more than that. And the reason why I think that Trump isn't a fascist isn't because there are no correlations between what he's doing and these traditional fascist movements. I think there absolutely are, in just the way that I was describing, right? Trumpism is very much a kind of hyper-real approach to politics. It's intended to be deeply entertaining in the sense of you can't look away. And I think it's successful at that. It appeals to affect, very strongly associated with various kinds of identitarian movements and all the resentments that you would associate with that. The one place where I think it reaches from fascism, and I think this is key, and Richard Evans wrote a good article about this recently, Cambridge historian who focuses on Nazism, which is that Trumpism isn't particularly militaristic, right? Both Nazism and Italian fascism and the minor fascist movements were really focused on this idea of using martial power to remake the European order and thence the world, right? In the image of the super Germanic state or the new Roman Empire, right? And we never really saw that with Trumpism, right? Trumpism, by contrast, was isolationist, but occasionally appealed to militaristic rhetoric. And Trump, of course, created the Space Force and invested billions of more dollars in the U.S. military. It never engaged in the kind of world restructuring ambitions and programs that we would associate with classical fascism, right? And I see this as important enough that we need to distinguish between these conventional forms of fascism and postmodern conservative Trumpism, even though they share a lot of affinities with one another.
Right. So I think a big thing that I got from that is that we can probably undersell the deeply ideological. We do this with a lot of politics, right? We do this with even people like Stalin, but we undersell the deeply ingrained ideological tonality, right? So, for example, someone like Stalin, people say that he's just this just dictator, this power hungry person. No, Stalin was a very dedicated Marxist in so many ways. Like he wasn't just power hungry for the sake of power, like we say. Same with Hitler, right? And then with Trump, there's this sort of, and with Trump, the difference being is there's this like sort of anti-ideological tonality, right? Is that sort of what you're kind of saying? This hyper-real spectacle of a president?
Well, I think we need to be careful here, right? You're absolutely right to say that Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler both had a more self-conscious conception of what they were trying to achieve than Donald Trump. Right? And they were also more ideologically invested in their projects, right? I don't think there's any kind of doubt about that.
Sure.
And you're also right to say that both Nazism and Italian fascism had a intellectual quality to them. Right? It's no coincidence that Nazism was able to attract people like Martin Heidegger or Carl Schmitt into its ranks, or that Italian fascism drew heavily on things like futurism, or Nietzsche, to provide a kind of ideological justification for these projects, right? Saying that, it's not like Trumpism doesn't have its intellectual defenders either, right? Now, Trumpism as a form of right-wing populism has a certainly pronounced anti-intellectual edge, right? But like most kinds of right-wing populism and conservatism generally, this anti-intellectual edge is always subordinated to the strategic need to actually have certain kinds of intellectual justifications to wage political combat at a relatively high level, right? So you saw the emergence during the Trump era of various Trumpist intellectuals, people like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson. You can also point to people like Sohrab Ahmari, right? Now, I don't think any of the arguments these people put forward justifying various Trumpy positions are particularly compelling, right? In fact, I don't really think they're compelling at all, right? But they do try to serve the ideological function of providing an intellectual defense of Trumpism.
Right.
Now, when I call Trumpism hyper-real, what I mean is in the precise Baudrillardian sense of that, right? Which is that earlier forms of politics in liberal democracies, particularly during the neoliberal era, tended to be very much grounded in material concerns, right? And this was actually a subject of great critiques by various Marxist philosophers at the end of the 20th century, right? That what we really see people like Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, all the way through to Obama trying to do is consciously restructure the global economic order to insulate capital from democratic pressures, right?
Yeah.
And with Trumpism, there's this stark shift towards a politics that doesn't even have a tangential connection to material concerns any longer, except insofar as they serve a symbolic role in what's ultimately this very identity-driven, culturally anxious kind of political agitation.
I was sorry. I don't mean to. I was gonna say, doesn't that's to me? I was gonna go ahead and point out. I was gonna see if what you thought about this. Doesn't that sort of seem like a weird new neo-fascism though? That's what I typically get. There is something. I find some of the most prevalent things about fascism is actually sort of like a hyper real symbolic thing, right? This mysticism of a unified Europe, or back in the better days, this sort of, especially in European fascism, where it's like this white nationalism. It seems like already, granted, like you said, it was much more materially and ideologically focused back then, but it seems like that hyper real entity, that idealism was already there, right? And it seems that Trump feeds on that a lot.
Sure. And I mean, again, I think there are remarkable affinities between Trumpism and fascism, right? In more respects than just one. I think you can also draw some tremendous historical parallels between the rise of Trump and the rise of various fascist parties early in the 20th century. People like Timothy Snyder have done a great job of this, right? Jason Stanley as well, who I interviewed not too long ago. Again, I think the only respect in which I am reticent to apply the fascist label to Trump isn't because of a lot of his domestic policies, where I agree that there's tremendous parallels between Trumpism and fascism, or about this focus on identity and national identity in particular as the locus of political concern. The one place where I really break with the fascist label is, again, that the fascist movements were both highly militaristic and internationalist in their ambitions, right?
Right.
And this wasn't a peripheral concern with them. It was actually very central to the worldview, right? If you think about something like Italian fascism, it was very fixated on this idea that ultimately we're going to be engaging in martial wars of conquest in order to establish a new Italian empire that will essentially make us the rulers of the Mediterranean, as is our destiny, right?
Right.
And there are all kinds of interesting and, though ultimately, of course, evil justifications given for this on quasi or pseudo-Nietzschean bases. And you can talk about Evola and all that kind of stuff, right? Nazism was even more militant in its kind of internationalist ambitions.
Right.
But what it added to this kind of project of creating a greater German empire, aspiring towards Lebensraum, was, of course, anti-Semitism, right? And this belief that not only were the Germans engaging in this empire-building project for the sake of Lebensraum, they were doing it because they had a world historical mission as the master race to combat their Semitic enemies, right? Who, of course, controlled global capitalism and global communism, both in some mysterious way that the Nazis never clarified, right? And you never really saw that with Trump, again. And you don't really see it with any of the other postmodern conservative movements, as I call them, right? If anything, all these movements tend to be isolationist, sometimes even anti-militarist. You can see that with some of Trump's rhetoric and foreign policy decisions. Insular, and much more focused on waging various forms of agonistic politics and directing agonistic political programs against domestic enemies rather than external international opponents. Right.
100%. No, I see that for sure. I'm
open to being convinced, by the way, I should say. It's not like I'm sitting there and I'm like, it's absolutely wrong to say that Trump is a fascist. And I've seen some compelling people make that argument. Probably the two most prominent are the ones I pointed to, Jason Stanley and Timothy Snyder. They almost convinced me on this. I just think that Professor Rich Evans is correct when saying that you can't really have a fascist movement without this focus on militaristic empire building.
Sure. I totally got you there. That's something that I see 100% that I think calling Trump like an actual like fascist, like again, I sometimes have done that, but it's mainly out of the use of lazy language on my point. I think he much more fits the bill of something like a neo-fascist or a new fascism. I think one of the things though that you kind of hammered in is this like hyper real sort of entity that Trump is. But in my mind, I think that in some ways, like I don't think that totally breaks the bill of this new weird neo-fascism that we're seeing. Because I think that I think something that Jameson was really, really good at was elaborating on how postmodernism is sort of like a cultural logic. I think sometimes we can undersell truly the all-encompassing like nature of things, such as like I think nihilism is better distinguished as a cultural logic rather than a state of being in some ways, right? That's
the way most people usually appeal to it when they're talking about nihilism, right?
Right, exactly. And so yeah, like I see that like we've just reached this threshold where like I don't know if there's a way. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if there's a way back to an actual truly material order of politics as we know it, like this is, and we can segue into this as well about like future left politics, as I was curious what you thought. But we have reached this threshold of analysis where the world, like a lot of people say this, and I'm really inclined to agree the more I read Baudrillard, but the future is fucking Baudrillard, dude. And it's like, I think our analysis of the world is truly, it's more than just raw materialism and raw material politics and movements like fascism or Marxism. In some ways, we're in the hyper real right now, and like we can't escape it.
Oh, I completely agree with that, right? And I should say that I'm not a reactionary of any sort, right? I don't think that there's any point in talking about going back to something.
No, 100,
right?
no, 150%. Yeah.
I mean, every now and then, I'll use that kind of language, like any good leftist. I sometimes nostalgically wax poetic about the good old days when we had a unified movement.
Oh, same.
And, there were democratic socialist parties in every country that were strong. And
Dude,
sure,
it's a travesty, right? Like, a lot of people think that they think postmodernism is some prescriptive politics. No, like, postmodernism is an analysis of how fucking shit this new world that we are in, right? Postmodernism is not good in a lot of ways, like.
100%.
Yeah. So no, 100%. I got you. I hope I didn't make you sound reactionary or anything like that. I apologize.
No. What I was just going to say is that when I argue for a kind of return to materialism, what I don't mean is a kind of empiricist materialism, right? This is actually what I think you see exemplified by people like F.A. Hayek or other kind of conservative materialists, right? Where essentially there's this assertion that, look, this is just the way the world is. That's a fact, and we have to settle for these facts, right? We have to kind of comport ourselves towards reality as it is, right? And you can actually see this kind of rhetoric still employed by the IDW crowd, right? Think about Mr. Facts and Logic himself, Ben Shapiro, right?
Right.
There's this attitude of this is just the way the world is, and we cannot change it. And since we cannot change it, all these kind of radical leftists out there who are saying that we can are just deluding themselves. They're just like completely out of the out of whack and all this stuff. No, I don't think that at all. I think the point of dialectical materialism, right, is to show us that whenever we try to talk about reality just being something, we're already lapsing into a kind of error, right?
Right.
Because material reality is always in motion. It's always changing, right? And we change with it, which is why you need to engage in a cultural analysis of the present, like Jameson is talking about.
100%.
Right? But what kind of the opportunities this leaves open for us, of course, if we take a dialectical material approach, is we don't need to allow the tyranny of facts to get in the way of postulating what a new kind of factical arrangement could be in the future, right? We look at the world as it is and we say, okay, let's accept that. Let's think about how we can make it better. If you want the pithy statement. That's the way I would interpret dialectical materialism.
Yeah, something that so we can kind of go into that as well. That's I take dialectics super seriously in our new approach, and that's something that God damn, man, the left, we don't think a lot of our typical analysis of practical politics is so undialectical in a lot of ways, where one of the problems too, where, you get into the sphere of like Marxism, Leninism, is you get into, we're talking about dialectical materialism, and that's a big it's turned into a cultural phenomenon on the internet, right? Where it's sort of like an aesthetic nature of Marxism that people want to tether themselves to for whatever reason. But there is this undialectical element to that, right? We're not changing our analysis. We're sticking to the same repetitive, stagnant things. And as Frederick Engels would put it, we're still using the quote unquote, I don't know why he calls it this, but he does, Lockean metaphysics, where we just this empiricism of just comparing and contrasting two singular things. And yeah, man, I was curious to what maybe your ideas like what the fuck do we do, man? Because I think the more that I read and the more I get into theory and philosophy, which is a relatively new endeavor for me, since I've started this channel, what the fuck do we do? Because I think you probably find a lot of the same problems on the left as I do. What do you think a good approach? How do we get people to maybe leave behind the cultural logic of politics, right? This like weird aesthetic nature, and maybe create a more intellectual approach to things?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question, right?
Right.
We could be sitting here and we could have many episodes on that question, right? I think I'll start with the more practical advice, and then I'll move to a more theoretical comment, right? Mm-hmm. So that we can kind of get the easy stuff out of the way first. I think that just from my experience, one of the big things that turns a lot of people off of leftist politics, young people in particular, right, is just the sense that leftists are killjoys, or leftists politicize everything, or leftists are super hard on everyone. Now, a lot of these cliches come from conservatives who are attacking us. But they are grounded in a certain degree of truth, right? You can always find people who fit this kind of cliche. And that's why I think it's really important to accept Michael Brooks's really sound advice that you need to be hard on systems. In fact, we need to be really hard on systems. In fact, I go further and say we need to be harder on the system as it is now than we ever have been before, right? But you should be kind to people for the most part, right? Some people just don't deserve it. But for the most part, you should be kind to people, right? And that's the only way that you're really going to convince people, not just that left-wing politics speaks to them intellectually, but that it can provide them with a sense of community, that it can provide them with a sense of hope, and that, frankly, they'll just like the people that they're around when they're engaging in political agitation.
Right. Isn't that such a weird problem though, and phenomenon? Me and Victor was on stream with his girlfriend Michelle, and we were talking. Yeah, absolutely. Like we were talking about that, like how prevalent shame is as a form of like politics and stuff. And I think when we started analyzing these things more discreetly, stuff that you do 100%, like it. God damn, man, it's devastatingly grim in a lot of ways, you know, like how many, when you look at things descriptively and very analytically, God, there's a lot of things that we have yet to overcome and we need to really work on.
Yeah, and I should say that I think that in some instances, shaming can serve a useful function.
Sure.
Right. So, for instance, when people shamed Sarah Huckabee Sanders for supporting the Trump administration, I think that that's warranted up to a certain point, right? I mean, if you're essentially sitting there and endorsing or abetting various forms of racist tyranny, then you should feel ashamed about that. And people should be aware of the fact that there's no place for that in a just society, okay? Saying that, I think that we are far too prone to turning to that as a weapon on the political left than we should be, right? And we lose a lot of supporters by essentially firing that bullet whenever we're faced with a problem, right? And I totally understand the temptation, right? I think that contemporary social media abets a shame culture, right? Because it's not really built to deal with complexities at the level of social structures and ideologies. So it tends to encourage us to locate the source of political problems in individuals. Right? I think also it's a product of the kind of Protestant culture that we've lived in and imbibed in for a long period of time, and that's spread across the globe because of American hegemony. Because there's this sense in the way that we engage in political activism that when we're attacking a set of ideas, it's important to locate that in a person. Right. And when we locate it in a person, what we end up doing isn't attacking their ideas so much as them. Right. It's not just your ideas that are bad. You hold those ideas because you're a bad person.
Right.
And again, I think that's really problematic because there are a lot of people who might have some bad ideas who nonetheless could be converted or convinced to adopt better ideas if we were to just try to reach out to them a little bit. Now, that's not everybody. You know, by no means is that everybody, but it's enough that it could make a difference, right?
Right.
Which is why I think that we should be cautious about this.
Right.
And the last reason, sorry,
I apologize.
No, I think there's a very human desire to want to locate the source of any of our problems, not just our political problems, but any of our problems, in something that's easy to understand, right? And when we locate the source of our political problems in an individual, or at least in a set of people, that's easy to understand. It gives us a target, you know what I mean? And I completely get the temptation. I do it myself, you know what I mean? When Trump was gone, I fucking broke out a big bottle of wine and drank it and was so happy. Right. But we need to recognize that the root of our problems goes well beyond certain individuals. And that includes Trump. Right. Trumpism is going to be long past when he's dead. And it's a mistake to just think that now that the mean orange man is gone, everything's going to be A-OK, which is another reason we need to reject this idea of turning to shame as the primary way we agitate for left-wing positions.
Right. I think that I think that's so damn relevant and important. I think that I think that in some ways, one thing that really would help us with this approach of understanding what we are doing is actually sort of thinking about things dialectically, not necessarily just in a processual way, right, where we look at things as processes, although that's very important, but we understand the true totality of what we're doing, right? Because like in a lot of ways, shaming and left politics, it's ironically the personal responsibility approach, right? Like it's funny, right wingers say that leftists aren't personally responsible, but leftists are some of the quickest people to like, look, like these people are supporting really fucking terrible things. I have to sacrifice maybe a relationship in order not to allow that to happen. No, like leftists take personal responsibility quite fucking seriously, but at the same time, there isn't a dialectical approach. There isn't an analysis of like the opposite end of what we are doing. And we do think of things in a very singular motion. And there isn't a very intellectual, truly like a robust way of looking at how we are operating in the political sphere online, whether that's in person or anything like that. And it really sometimes sucks. I don't think we understand a lot of the true totality of like what we do. And in some ways it's kind of impossible, but in other ways we don't go far enough to even try.
Yeah, and I should say, I don't think anybody can really be blamed for that, just in keeping with what I said previously, right? And part of that is just because the kind of way that we engage in political agitation has changed so dramatically just in the last 20 years that no one can be blamed for not being able to keep up with it, right? I mean, 20 years ago, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no YouTube. The internet was just a kind of weird thing that people used to create blogs and send emails. And now the whole terrain has transformed completely.
Yeah.
Right? And I think Hegel was absolutely right that philosophy, and that includes critical theory, is always limited by its own time. And sometimes the best we can do is just conceive our own time and thought, right? But things have changed so rapidly that the minute we think we've grasped our own time and thought, it's already changed, right?
100%.
Into something else. And I don't think anybody should feel bad about the fact that we can barely keep up any longer. But nonetheless, we have to do the best we can as critical theorists and as left intellectuals. And if we fail, then I think we take the Beckettian attitude of, well, we fail again, and then we fail better. Right?
Yep, exactly. And in so many ways, isn't that and what you just said, like the true essence of this postmodern world, right? Where we truly are understanding the limits of our time, right? We're understanding how we can grasp the entire total order, the realm around us. Like that is, in my mind, almost that is the step past modernity where we understand, well, holy fuck, we are so limited past this just realm of being and doing and stuff. Like it's impossible to nail stuff down half the time.
Yeah, and I mean, the book that I'm working on right now, it's called The Emergence of Postmodern Society, for pal Grant McMillan, is on the roots of postmodernity. So some of your listeners might be interested in that when it comes out. Allocated in 3 different sources, I should say. But I think that we need to get past 2 temptations when it comes to modernity, right? One is the kind of classical Marxist temptation to just see postmodernity as inherently bad or inherently a reactionary epoch.
Right.
And there are some figures like Jameson himself, I should say, and David Harvey, even people like Mark Fisher, brilliant theorists, right? And I've learned a lot from them. But they do take this kind of pessimistic attitude that postmodernity constitutes a regression from the more activist period of modernity. Right. And I don't think that's entirely true. Right. I think postmodernity has a lot of latent potentialities within it for emancipatory politics that we're just starting to explore, and that pessimism can just be excessive optimism that's been disappointed too much.
Definitely.
Right? Yeah. And so I think these people were disappointed. They gave into a pessimistic outlook. I think then that's just not the right approach, right? We should look at the potentialities within postmodern culture for emancipation, where they actually exist, and try to mobilize those, right? Rather than pining nostalgically for some earlier period where things were allegedly better, especially because they probably weren't much better then, right? The other thing about postmodernity that I think it's important to understand is that it is inherently limited, inherently limiting in certain important respects, right? This is kind of the inverse of what I was just saying. And the limitations of the postmodern epoch are also a good place to locate our theoretical inquiries, because once we understand those limitations, we can understand how to put pressure on existing social structures, since that's where they tend to be weakest.
Right.
And Corey Robin has written a really good book about this, where he talks, for instance, about how different reactionary institutions are vulnerable right now. And rather than just thinking about wholesale structural transformation all the time, it can be helpful for progressives to sometimes think about where they can most meaningfully make a difference. Because, of course, changing one thing might not seem like very much, but it can have ripple effects down the line that might prove more dramatic, seen from hindsight.
Yeah, 150%. Like we, in so many ways, we have to try to understand we should try to create new approaches to understanding the existing social order, rather than sort of like ready at hand have an approach to prescriptive politics like, oh, we already understand what's going on, we just need to find new ways and how to combat that. Rather, it's sometimes the opposite, right? It's sometimes like, well, maybe your prescriptive approach is right, but maybe your actual descriptive analysis that you think is just like a priori isn't right. Like there are some things that we need to work on, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I actually think that there are a lot of reasons for optimism, cautious optimism.
I'm totally curious, because I find myself, I would love that we can segue into that. That's something that I kind of struggle with. I'm a little bit of a doomer, and I try to combat that, but I would love to hear why, because I trust your view on this.
Sure. And I mean, believe me, I totally get it. Right. I mean, back to the good old days of the 2008 recession, right? One of the things that I felt at the time was it's extremely depressing that even though we're witnessing this gigantic economic downturn, nobody's actually questioning the fundamentals, right? Mm-hmm. There's absolutely nobody who's sitting there being like, well, this testifies to the limitations of the capitalist mode of production and the kind of neoliberal state apparatus that's built atop of it. Almost everyone said what we need to do is try to fix this, because the bones aren't broken. It's just the kind of edifice built atop of them. Right? Contrast that with right now, where you have a robust democratic socialist movement in the United States. There's another recession, and people are talking pretty overtly about the need for much more imaginative change. I think that's reason for optimism, right? Mm. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this. I think part of it is you have millennials and Gen Zers who've both grown up in times of economic precarity and crisis, which makes them a lot more sensitive to the limitations of the capitalist mode of production, maybe than Gen X or the baby boomers were. I also think it's because changes in digital technologies mean it's easier for us to get a lot of our ideas across than it was before, right? And I also think it's because there's a lot of good people out there who've been working really hard to change the parameters of the discussion, to bring things like democratic socialism back onto the table, right? And that includes everyone from politicians like AOC to YouTube channels like your own, to podcasts like what we do at Plastic Pills, right?
Yeah.
So I look around and I take that all together, and I definitely don't apply some kind of teleological significance to it, like, oh, this is all evidence that we're going to win. Our victory is, 5 years down the line, but at least it gives me some hope for the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's definitely a good way to approach it, right? That's something that we can forget too, where, maybe I'll take another approach that I see that, sometimes you'll find people describing like something like social democracy as something sort of reactionary. They're like, oh, that's a centrist position. But really, like what you said, like we've actually moved to a point where like maybe like the idea that people are even saying that in the United States might be indicative of something good rather than bad, rather than people taking probably an inaccurate approach on social democracy, which is not something reactionary at all. Matter of fact, in North America in general, social democracy is quite radical in a lot of ways, as depressing as that is. But I think
that's exactly right. And I just wanted to interject and say, I think Zizek is exactly right here, right? And so is Bhaskar Sankara, the author of the Socialist Manifesto, mm-hmm. right? There can sometimes be this vulgar Leninist impulse to say revolution or nothing, right?
Right.
Either we completely tear down the system or it's just some kind of reactionary tinkering around the edges. And I don't think that's true. I think what you accomplish when you achieve something like universal healthcare for all in the United States, or free university tuition, for instance, in Canada, something that we're fighting for, right, is you move the parameters of the discussion.
Right.
Right. And once you start moving them in the right direction, it's a lot easier to try to keep pushing in that direction. Right? Mm-hmm. If your only thing is you have to have a revolution, and a violent militaristic revolution, and change things completely from the bottom up, you're going to be waiting an awful long time. And I also think a lot of people are going to have strong reservations about that. You get universal healthcare for all in the United States. You get universal public post-secondary education for people in Canada and the US and Mexico, right? Mm-hmm. Then you can start agitating for the next set of reforms.
Right. Yeah.
And they can be more dramatic.
Right. I think that's a good approach, because that's something that I see that, like you said, the vulgar Leninist approach, that's totally true. And that's it can be kind of a problem in a lot of ways. Because in so many ways, like, we can't, like, no one's, like, in truly the most simplistic way, we can't overthrow the US government. It's just not going to happen with an AR-15. It's not going to happen with arming the proletariat. It's not going to, like, I think this discussion is kind of bad in a lot of ways. It's truly overly simplistic. But I'm curious to see, because that's a lot of, like, the biggest left-wing questions, like how do we get past a system of hyper commodity and capitalism and austerity? Yeah.
I should say also, and I think this is a key point that I've been trying to stress a lot in my recent work. I also don't think it's particularly Marxist. This kind of vulgar Leninism.
100%.
The reason is that this temptation to say what we need to do is go to year zero, right, is thoroughly anti-dialectical and ahistorical, right? What it resembles more than anything is utopian socialism of the kind that Marx and Engels criticized, which is basically, we'll tear down everything and we'll rebuild from scratch and it'll be better, right? And one of the great theoretical innovations of dialectical materialism and the kind of critical theory tradition Marx basically developed, amongst others, is to say, no, right? There is no year zero. You're always building from within a set of historical conditions. You need to be very cognizant of these when you try to change things, because that's the only way that you'll be able to change them successfully.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
And I think a lot of people who lean too much in the Leninist direction of Marxist-Leninism forget this lesson, right?
Yeah, and it's something inherently anti-dialectical in so many ways, right? A lot of Marxist-Leninists talk about dialectics, but I think even being in the theoretical terrain of Marxism-Leninism in 2021 is quite anti-dialectical just on its own, right? And that's just the theoretical terrain. Nonetheless, the actual prescriptive political ideas set in motion. I think that like I value someone like Zizek, where he takes a sort of technological approach, where he says, like, look, like this new emancipation past capitalism, it's going to be something that's far more elusive, and in some ways it could be something like almost private. Like, he talked about how the digital sphere of commodification, it resists capitalism in the sense that people pirate the shit out of it. Or, for example, another bigger example is that for corporations to sell their products, they can't, like, they, in some ways they have to release their product as an open source thing. And so we might be seeing, like, with automation, with the potential blocking of technological progress, because if you just keep placing financial barriers to new technology, people aren't going to be they won't be able to consume it. We're going to reach a potential point where asking, like, for money essentially is going to stagnate our technological process. And even in a capitalist system, capitalists are going to run into issues because they don't want to do that either. So it's like the true movement past capitalism is so much more complex than just overthrow capitalism, the bourgeoisie institutions, and institute a dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I completely understand why it is that people might want to fetishize this particular form of revolutionary activity, right? It has a kind of aesthetic grandeur. There are historical parallels that people point to with the French and Russian revolutions. And I think it also just appeals to a certain kind of militaristic urgency, right? That we need to do something now, right?
And to be fair, I want to interject, like that militaristic urgency. I want to be fair, like that's a very valid feeling to have, right? We're facing climate change right now. We're facing,
absolutely,
yeah.
No, I'm not meaning to discount it, right?
Sure.
I just think that it needs to be channeled in more productive directions.
100%.
By recognizing that kind of achievements and shifts that you were talking about earlier on aren't just epiphenomenal, right? One by one, they might not look like much, but cumulatively, they can actually bring us to what Bhaskar calls 5 minutes past capitalism, if we manage to push hard enough and fast enough, right? And this might not appeal to a certain kind of aestheticized politics, but I think it's a lot more realistic. And ultimately, it will have much more clear benefits for a lot of the people that we're trying to help, which is ultimately what the point of any left-wing politics should be. Right? Not just about appealing to our aestheticized sensibilities, but making a material difference for the people on the ground and ensuring that everyone has an equal opportunity at living a life of dignity and without precarity.
Right. And it's funny you went into that. It isn't a sort of, you said, a fetish of Leninism and Marxism, because that's sort of the problem. There is a massive fetish of Marxism, of like it turns into a cultural thing. Oddly enough, I had a YouTuber named Prolocult on, and I think he falls pretty firmly into the Marxist Leninist camp, but he's a very concrete thinker, and I appreciate him a lot. But he did point out, he's like, yeah, there is a massive cultural Marxist thing that is happening. It's this fetish of Marxism, but in so many ways, it's really ironic. Like, what is more idealistic than a fetish of something like Marxism and stuff like that? So I think that having discussions, very honest discussions, appreciating the urgency to rid the world of a very horrid, brutal system is incredibly important. But it's also extremely important to have discussions like me and you are having. I'm sure Bhaskar, I think he's a big proponent on like how like democratic socialism, how that actually is quite a radical system, and how it's actually in so many ways it's a very promising system past capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say, I'm by no means a dogmatic. I'm not a dogmatic Marxist in any sense, right?
Sure.
I think Marx was a great thinker. Like any great thinker, he made plenty of great errors, right? And rather than seeing a deviation from a orthodox Marxist framework as some kind of heresy, which I still do see sometimes people claim, right? There are a lot of really hard-edged Marxists out there who don't accept any kind of deviation.
Right.
We should see that as a compliment to the ingenuity and genius of somebody like Marx, right? If somebody is really a great thinker, there's no greater testament to their ability that you can pay than to be critical of them and to try to advance their thought in a very productive and creative and original way, right?
Absolutely.
The kind of people who aren't worthy of this kind of critical attention are definitely ideologues, demagogues, and dogmatists who have nothing interesting to say. And so you either have to take them at face value or just reject them.
Right. I mean, we should fundamentally try to work away. This is a problem where we can become intellectually lazy really, really fast. And that's a very, I think that's something in so many ways that marks the end of like, because I think you have recognized this as well. There was like this period in 2015, 2016 to like 2018 of a serious uptick in like conservative, like reactionary politics. But I think exactly why they failed and that's falling apart is because of the intellectual laziness of it, like the internet, the intellectual dark web and, Ben Shapiro and shit. I think a lot of people realize how fucking lazy that was. And it's something that I do, care is that on the online sphere, because online politics, a lot of people is like, well, Twitter's not real life, YouTube's not real life. Well, as we see, technology plays a way larger role in politics than we could ever imagine looking back. And that's something I do care about. I don't want us to fall into this trap of really intellectually lazy approaches to politics. And yeah.
No, I think that's really good. And I guess I'll just end with that, right? Because I think you're exactly right. There can always be this temptation to turn to easy pseudo-intellectual arguments, usually because they're popular, they're easy to format, and they're easy to digest, right? And they're also pretty lucrative, right?
Right, exactly. It makes a shit ton of money.
Yeah, you can make a lot of money doing that, right? I think there's also a place sometimes for there's definitely a place for making things accessible allowing giving the public the tools it needs to make sense of some of these more highfalutin ideas. I'm not disdaining any of that. But I think the truth is that ideas that endure are those that are powerful, well-formulated, subject to relentless critique, and subject to relentless self-criticism by their authors, I should say. Right. So while there'll always be a place for these kind of pop IDW types, I don't imagine they're going to have a very lasting legacy. And I really hope that once some of their fans grow out of them, they'll turn to a much better politics and realize the superficiality of a lot of these guys and their outlook. Right.
100%.
That's when we can try to hook them in with our ideas, because our ideas are better and they're going to make people's lives better. Right.
Yeah. 150%, dude. I couldn't have said it better.
Yes. Okay. So I gotta go.
Okay.
But, thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, guys. Chat. Matthew McManus. Here's his book. What is Postmodern Conservatism? You said you're writing a new book as we speak. Yeah.
Yeah, the emergence of postmodernity, or the emergence of postmodern society. Haven't settled on it yet, but should be out later this year. And for those who are interested in the What is Postmodern Conservatism book, this one will kind of give the theoretical grounding to it in a much more robust way.
Gotcha. Awesome, dude. All right. Well, dude, I really appreciate you coming on. Like, we'll have to do this again. Maybe you and Victor, whatever. Like, I love talking to you guys. I appreciate it a lot.
Anytime, man.
All right. Thank you, dude. I will see you later.